Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. This is another solo episode with Kylene. Today, we are talking about the question, how do I know if I should stay or go after betrayal? This is probably one of the most common questions that I get from women all the time. You have discovered betrayal, you've discovered pornography or a secret sex addiction or a physical affair, and you are just really conflicted with the idea of dealing with this and accepting it. Like, what does that say about me? Who stays with their partner after they've been cheated on? Or leaving and letting it go, releasing someone that you have spent a lot of time with and maybe have children with, and all these types of things. There's a lot of considerations there. And so obviously it's a big conflict. And also there's an aspect to it, and I think this is what comes through a lot, is what's the right thing to do, right? People think there's a right answer to this, and they want to make sure they're making a smart decision or an ethical decision, right? They don't want to be labeled as someone who's tolerating abuse, right? So this question comes up for a lot of reasons. So today, I just want to share my personal stories of being divorced and also so I've been betrayed and divorced and betrayed and reconciled. So I want to share those two stories, the similarities and more so the differences in those relationships, and then walk through green or red flags when it comes to safety and health in a relationship. So ultimately, no one can tell you what the right thing to do is. Only you know what is right for you. But hopefully this episode will provide you with some food for thought. Maybe you can relate to some of my experiences and feel less alone. And that's a big one, because I want to make sure that you know that whether you are choosing divorce or choosing to reconcile, you are not alone. And there isn't always a quote unquote right choice. So let's talk about it. I was 22 when I got married the first time in 2008. I think it was technically 21 because I got married in May, but I digress. So I'm going to share the details that I remember, but starting the episode with this caveat, I either have a horrible memory or my brain has blocked out a significant portion of that time in my life. So there are only a few parts that I remember well. So leading up to this, I had my first real boyfriend who I thought I was madly in love with. The summer leading into my freshman year of college, he was a college boy that I had met visiting my older sister. And for me, it was almost love at first sight. I literally picked him out in a room and told my sister I was going to marry him. Ridiculous, I know, but it's what happened. So we ended up dating for about 9 months or so, and I'm going to share this piece of history just because I want to begin to create a picture for you of how I was not living in full confidence and authenticity. I was living in boy crazy la la land for myself, which led to a lot of emotional instability, dependence on the relationship, and let's be honest, drama. So in this relationship, I very much felt like he was the love of my life. And just keep in mind, this is my first real boyfriend, right? My first real relationship. We were going to get married and I wanted to spend all of our time together. I had lots of free time, but he didn't. And this became a huge problem for me because when I moved onto campus, we didn't get to spend a lot of time together. I felt so frustrated and maybe rejected because when we were dating long distance before I came up to school, he would come down to visit or vice versa, and we would spend time together. But once I moved up to school, it's like time together wasn't set aside and prioritized. So, if he's coming to visit me, he set aside 2 or 3 days to just hang out. And like that was what was on the agenda, right? But when I came up to school, that time wasn't really set aside. And so I didn't feel prioritized. I even remember asking him to schedule dates in his calendar for me. And his reply was that he didn't want to pencil in his girlfriend. I don't know what the deal was with that, if he felt weird about it or what, but I was like, dude, if you don't pencil it in, we're never going to hang out. Anyway, long story short, I was very codependent and clingy and not emotionally stable and self-secure in that relationship. And so, as you would expect, he broke up with me. But I did not see this coming. This was essentially the creation of my abandonment wound, because he came over one day and what I felt like was completely out of the blue, he told me we were breaking up. Oh, I was so devastated. I sat on his lap and probably cried for about 30 minutes. Like, you can't be serious. What do you mean? When he left, I did the whole dramatic chase after the car, crying my eyes out, don't leave me, panic mode situation. I am not kidding you. Anyone that was watching this from an outside perspective would probably be like, yeah, she's crazy. Of course you're breaking up with that. Right? But this was devastating to me. I did not see it coming. It just shook me so hard in that moment and took me so off guard. So I spent a lot of time over the school year hoping we would get back together and also dating other guys, which is totally smart, right? So basically my focus when I went to school was boys. Period. End of story. I was not really focused on anything else. And honestly, I really regret that. I wish I had focused on friendships and experiences. But anyway, I'm just being honest and I'm painting the picture here. So fast forward to the next summer, I think it was, I'm home and I'm going to dinner with some friends of mine. And this waiter starts talking to me and hitting on me fairly obviously. And as we leave, he gives me his number. And that is how I met my first husband. We started dating and there were red flags all over the place that I just steamrolled. One of them was that, my faith is very important to me. And one of the red flags, this is fairly small, but depending on where you're at, it may be really important. He went to church because I went to church. Okay. So this may come up later in talking about this in another part of the story, but that's sort of just, he started blending into the life that I wanted as opposed to being his own person. And that's very, that can be common with manipulative behavior, but I'm not going to go too much into that. So any red flag that came up, I wasn't identifying them as red flags. I didn't really know how to identify them, right? Looking back, there were so many about how we interacted and just all sorts of things. Another one, just as another example, is he really pushed me away from my family and particularly one of my friends that didn't really like him. I should have listened to my friends and my family, you guys. I should have listened. Note to self for future. Really learned a lesson with that one. But, he started to distance me a little bit from them. And that's a huge red flag. So one thing that happened was I had gone on antidepressants after my last relationship and that big dramatic breakup because I had spent months crying and I just felt like I needed help. So when I started dating my ex-husband, I felt like I could get off my antidepressants. Oh, look, new shiny relationship, right? Happy little dopamine hits, right? This is exciting. I'm getting attention, right? Are you hearing a lot of codependency and unhealthy emotional regulation patterns here? Because I certainly am, as I have looked back. So I'm dating this guy, and when you are really young, sometimes you have stupid goals of getting married and getting out of your family home, right? I love my parents, but I did want to move out. And I think that was part of my motivation. I wanted to have my own life. This guy was the reason I got off my antidepressants, obviously. And we had sex before we got married. So I think all of that combined really contributed to this just storm of bad decisions that I was making. I almost called the wedding off about 2 weeks prior. My parents were indirectly hinting in this direction, and I was noticing some problems myself. And in fact, prior to this, I had tried to break up with this guy a few times. I remember one time in particular feeling really happy about it, that we had broken up. And that should have been a clue. But then, because I didn't have a strong sense of self at the time, he bought me some presents, promised to be better, and hooked me right back in. He did the same thing when I considered calling off the wedding. I remember him making a list of things that he would improve. And at that point, I just felt so much pressure because everything was set. Things had been paid for. He was promising to do better. So I pressed on. My dad, you guys, right before he walked me down the aisle, gave me a hug and said, you don't have to do this. One of the many times I should have listened to my parents. Well, I obviously went through with it, and I immediately knew I made a mistake. Immediately. I was crying on my honeymoon that I didn't want to be married. The parts of me that I had suppressed and the emotions I had ignored were all coming out full force, demanding to be heard. But what could I do now? I was a Christian girl who had had sex before marriage and now was married. Can't get out of that. I was stuck. A few months later, I find a folder of pornography on the computer desktop, and then I do a search and find more. I confronted him, but at the time, I had no resources. This isn't something I was calling my mom about or talking to friends about. I had no information. I had a conversation with him, and then that was about it. He denied, of course. Not that he hadn't looked at pornography, but that he wasn't looking at it now. He said that this folder, that had been on the desktop, by the way, must have been a carryover from an old computer and somehow gotten onto this new one. It's not something that he had recently looked at. Ugh. And that was that. I don't remember really believing him, right? I was skeptical, but I didn't have any resources. I don't even really remember having any other conversations about it, except that I said I wouldn't wear certain things for sexy time anymore because I saw them in the photos and it made me feel like I just didn't want to do that. This is not something that I was calling my mom about or talking to friends about, and I just didn't have the information. And so I'm sure many of you have found yourself in that position. I felt very isolated. I felt very alone, and I felt very trapped. About 1.5 years into our marriage, I was so miserable, I told him, I think I want a divorce. Again, I don't remember a lot of that conversation. In fact, I think it was pretty short, and that was that. We never talked about it again. Oh my gosh, another red flag. You guys, so many red flags. If you don't feel like you can talk to your partner about your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your fears, your insecurities, all these things, that is such a problem. The person that you are spending the rest of your life with and sharing your body with should be the safest person in your life. You should feel totally supported and validated and coming and saying, I feel anxious about this. I'm sad about this. I'm nervous about this. This part of our relationship, I'm not feeling like we're doing well here. I'd really like to work on this, right? I didn't know how to do that at the time. So I said something, but again, that was about it. In my mind, however, in my worldview and in my life at the time, I changed my mind right away. I was going to fix this. I was going to take responsibility and be a good Christian wife. I just needed to fix my attitude. That's what I needed to do. So I did what any good Christian girl would do, and I bought a book. I can't remember what I had looked up or looked on Amazon. I don't know if it was saving your marriage or avoiding divorce or fixing your marriage I don't know. I was just trying to fix it and take responsibility. So I did. I fixed my attitude. I read this book. I remember being in a very different mental space for a few months. And again, we're not having conversations about our relationship or our happiness or, anything like that. We were just living our lives, checking in and out, going to work every day, doing the routine. And that was about it. So then about 3 months later, we shared a car at the time. We shared my car, and I drove to the office to pick him up. And he's sitting in the back with my parents. So just to clarify, my dad started and owned a business, and I worked for my dad for many years. I worked as a customer service agent, and then when my ex and I started dating, my ex got a job with my dad as well. And my dad was, it's really kind, right? He's trying to provide both for my ex and for his daughter, right? If we're going to be together. And it worked out for a long time. It was really great in some ways, but I go to pick him up. He's sitting in the back in my dad's office. My mom and my dad are both there. They look very serious. I'm like, hey, what's going on? And they go, well, we'll let him tell you. So we get in the car. And I'm like, what the heck was happening? And he goes, I've been accused of sexual harassment. I was like, well, by who? Well, happened to be his secretary. I said, no way that's true. That's not true, right? That's not true, right? That didn't happen. We're driving at this point. We're driving to the house. I don't remember exactly what he told me at that time, but he began to allude that it might not completely be false. I started laughing. I thought, how stupid do you have to be to cheat on your wife with the secretary in your father-in-law's office? I mean, it was just ridiculous, right? It just sounded ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So, come to find out, he had been engaging with his secretary. It was true. And his excuse or his reasoning behind it was, well, you told me that you wanted a divorce and I was sad. And my secretary noticed I was sad. And, we started talking about it and that sort of thing. And the rest is history. She began to comfort him and they started getting close and they started talking and all of that fun stuff. They both always claimed that they never had sex together, but I never really knew if that was true. So I went to some friend's house at the time that we were in a house church together, a life group together, a small group of Christians that gathered outside of church. And I started telling them what had just happened. And I think I was still in shock at that point. I was like, I don't even know. I was also, I think even in that moment, there was probably a sense of relief that I had been so miserable and this was my out, right? So while I was shocked and this blew me away, I was not expecting this information. There was also a very, very quick decision to take action on my part. And I went to my friend's house. I kind of let them know what was happening. They drove me back to my house so I could gather some of my things, and I moved back in with my parents. Now, at the time, in my mind, I was thinking, oh, this is just going to be for a weekend. But if you remember back to when I had tried to break up with him previously and I had that sense of relief, I think I felt that almost immediately when I separated and moved back in with my parents. It became very clear to me very quickly that I would not be moving back and I would not be trying to reconcile. I was just happier when we weren't together. So then I experienced lots of different pressure. Oh my goodness, so much pressure from the church, from my pastor at the time. That's a whole other church trauma conversation. From the life group, from my dad, from all these people to consider, getting back together. Now, my dad, it was really interesting because remember, he was the one that said, you don't have to do this, but he is very religious and takes marriage very seriously. And as he should, he's a wonderful human being who always tries to do the right thing, and is very conscientious about doing the right thing. And he wanted me to do the right thing. And so he wanted me to really take this seriously and to think about it. And I said, Dad, listen, I'm getting divorced. I'm moving forward. And he just, can you wait? Can you wait? Can you think about it? Can you give it some time? I'm not sure how long it took, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. He came home one day, and I'll never forget this. This meant so much to me at the time. It still does today. It's always meant so much to me. I remember I was sitting on the couch, and he came home. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, I understand now. I understand now. And that's because my ex-husband had essentially shown his true colors to my dad that day, and my dad began to kind of understand what I had lived with for about 2 years. So now this gets into a lot of the comparison between my previous relationship and my current relationship, and a lot of the red flags that were present, because during the divorce process, talk about true colors coming out. When I began to learn about sex addiction and betrayal trauma and how addicts typically behave, I was so blown away because I thought, I feel like I'm learning more about my ex-husband than my current husband. So there was so much manipulation, so much gaslighting, so much blaming through this process. Oh my gosh. Now, I will take the responsibility and say, I should not have gotten married. I made a bad decision. That was on me. That was on me. And I made all of my own choices as an adult to get into the relationship and all this kind of stuff. But there's really, I've never understood there's really no excuse when a relationship ends to just be mean to each other. I just don't understand that. But people that like to be in control and manipulate, that's not how they view the world, and they want to be in control, and so they manipulate. And so my ex really was quite excellent at coming across one way to the world and to people he wanted to present a certain way, like the church or our pastor or even my dad up until that point, and not be like that internally. So one of the things that I was so thankful for, because if any of you have been in a situation where you have been gaslit or blamed or manipulated by a really good manipulator, you will understand this, and that is that you start questioning yourself. And you start going, well, is he really that bad? Like, was the relationship really that bad? Should I give it another chance? Like, am I wrong? And you start doubting yourself. So I was so thankful that I still had the password to his email, because then I got definitive proof that what I was feeling in my gut, in my soul of souls on a cellular level, was true. I would read these emails where he was just a different person. He would come across to the world as this, I am the good Christian husband who wants to reconcile, and my wife is being a horrible Christian by not wanting to forgive me. And I just love her, and I want to stay in this relationship, and I'm doing the right thing. And then I saw this email where he emailed, I don't know if it was one of his friends, and was just like, I'm so glad Kylene is out of my life. And he was bad-mouthing me and saying all the things he didn't like about me, all the things that he got to do because I wasn't there and I was such a buzzkill. I believe, if I remember correctly, he even solicited a woman on Craigslist during this time. Oh boy, was I so glad that I saw that. It helped me so much. That's not something I ever called him on. It's not something I ever addressed. Of course, we were getting divorced at this point. But for me, that was absolutely so helpful to see that. So if you're in this situation, and if I can give you a piece of encouragement, it is trust that inner knowing. You know the person that you're married to. You know how you relate to each other. If there is a part of you that is telling you that something's going on, or that something isn't right, or that something's not sincere, trust that part. You don't need the documentation. You don't need the evidence. You know, your soul knows. I'm so thankful that I had that to just prove to me that my soul was right. That he was manipulating people. He was gaslighting me. He was blaming me. He was totally changing the truth. And that was one thing that through the divorce just blew my mind. The conversations that we would have where I was like, this is not true. This is not reality. I could not handle it. My head would just absolutely explode. And when I look back, I think, man, these were just two people that should not have been in a relationship together. We just did not work. And I will fully admit 100% that I was not my best self in that relationship. Not even a little bit. Not even a little bit. He would trigger me in just the right ways for me to just be a very unhealthy version of myself. And now I'm not blaming him for me being unhealthy. Obviously, on this podcast, we promote personal responsibility. I was in charge of all the decisions that I was making. And that environment that I put myself in was a very unhealthy environment. And I allowed myself to respond in unhealthy ways. And so when I look back, I go, two people that absolutely should not have been in a relationship. And then when I learned about addiction and betrayal and manipulation and gaslighting, it answered so many questions for me. And again, just reiterated that I did the right thing. Oh, man, so many red flags. So many red flags. Listen to your gut. All right, so that relationship ended. There was a lot of difficulty in getting the divorce. He would not show up for the court dates. He was very resistant to the process. He wasn't helpful, which apparently, according to his email, he was excited that we weren't together, right? So I don't know what he was doing, but he was exerting control, and he extended the process. I'm sure he could have done it longer, but it seemed like as long as he could. And eventually we got divorced. I think timeline wise, it was about 2.5 years, but we had separated. I think I left the house a few months before our 2-year anniversary. So if you're kind of thinking about a timeline there. All right. So fast forward, I never did any trauma work, right? I never did any betrayal work. I didn't know about that. I just was like, woohoo, I'm free to be. I'm happy. I'm out of this relationship. And guys, I felt so happy. There was not a day once we had separated that I regretted my decision. There was not a day that I looked back that I was like, oh, I wish I had given it more time or I had tried harder. Once we were separated and I was pursuing divorce, I was all in, and I felt all of the confirmation that I needed mentally, emotionally, and physically, that I was away from this relationship and a happier, healthier being going through that process. Even during the annoying divorce process, even during that, I was just a happier person. And so I started to move on with my life. Again, I didn't do any, I was feeling great, right? I'm free. I'm out of this relationship. This is amazing. Life is full of opportunities. I don't need to do trauma counseling. I don't need to do therapy work. I had no idea. So fast forward to 2011, and I get set up with Patrick, and I meet him, and this is a relationship where there were no red flags. I mean, not a single one. I did not have cold feet for even a moment before we walked down the aisle. This was the absolute love of my life. Now, I know you've heard me say that a couple times. Let's just clarify that because I feel like I'm going to come across sounding like a love addict. I was a very different person from the girl that quote unquote fell in love with her first real boyfriend in college. And by the time I met Patrick, I was completely different. I was a completely different person. And I had done a little bit. I mean, again, I was really still very young at this time, but I had done a little bit of work personally. I was like, okay, this is not working out for me. I've been divorced. I've had some breakups. Clearly, I need to do some internal work and kind of think through what are the similarities between these people. What are the things that what attracted me to them? What do I not like about them? What do I actually want in life? So I had spent some time doing some internal reflection. When I met Patrick, he checked off every box. And this is something that I had shared with one of my friends, a couple of the things that I was looking for. And she set us up. So I have this glowing review from a friend of mine who knows me really well and loves me and is still to this day an awesome friend of mine. I had no red flags. We got along so well. We clicked so well. And this was, what I would consider a really healthy relationship. The two relationships that I told you about so far, and there were others in between, emotional drama, right? Codependency, just crazy. Brief little note here. I did have a what I would consider to be a very healthy relationship with someone in between my divorce and when I met Patrick. And who knows if that was God kind of teaching me that healthy relationships can be calm and healthy. I don't know. Obviously, it didn't work out. We ended up having different religious perspectives and everything, and it just didn't work out, and that's okay. Obviously, that was the right decision. But I was moving in a healthy direction. I guess that's kind of the point I wanted to share here. I was moving in a healthy direction. So I never had any red flags or cold feet. And if you compare when I got married the first time to when I got married the second time, they could not be more different in how it felt in my mind and my body moving into that relationship. I just felt like it was so safe and so right, and we were meant to be. And I lived that way for the 10 years that we were together before I found out about Patrick's addiction. So compare and contrast. I had been married a very short time. When I got divorced, the first time, I was married for a very short period of time, discovered pornography, did not address it, and experienced a lot of gaslighting, blaming, manipulation, and all of those massive difficulty during the divorce, and a lot of emotional, high-charged emotions during the relationship and that sort of thing. Married Patrick, had a very stable, healthy, loving, supportive relationship, mutually really serving each other and loving each other and wanting the best for each other, and then discover that he had betrayed me with his cyber sex addiction, and he'd never told me. Now, this is one of the reasons that this was so painful for me. I had told him about my previous marriage and about finding pornography and how, that's an issue for me. I had asked him the questions. I had shared this story, and he still didn't tell me, right? And then we had many, many conversations throughout our marriage about pornography and cheating and infidelity, and still didn't tell me. So boy, oh boy, did this blow up my world. And we can talk about all of that separately. And I know we've talked a lot about our relationship on this podcast, so I'm not going to rehash all of that for you today. But compare and contrast the response of these two people. Patrick immediately took responsibility. Never once did he blame me. And throughout this process, while he said, you are more than welcome to separate from me and divorce from me, because I feel like not only is that you're right, but you probably should because I've hurt you so much. He has done everything in his power to build trust, to be honest, to not manipulate. I don't necessarily think that was hard for him per se, but he was very aware of it. He goes, I want to make sure I'm not. He would bring things to have a conversation about, and he would even say, I want to make sure this isn't coming across as manipulative. He was really conscientious about being vulnerable and being forthcoming and putting my needs ahead of his own through this recovery process. And so that was just a huge green flag for me as I was going through this, because there was a period of time where as I was going through discovery and my emotions were incredibly charged and the anxiety was high, and I was finding out new betrayal after new betrayal after new betrayal as I was learning and putting the pieces together. There was a time where because of the trauma brain and the debris that was floating around from all my previous experiences, where I started mushing the two relationships. And that really bothered me because I had been so unhappy in the first and so happy in the second. Oh my gosh, comparing the two and feeling like they were mushed and you did something that my ex did, that felt so terrible. Oh my gosh, did that feel terrible. It just felt really weird to blend those worlds. They had been so separate and so distinct. And eventually, as the trauma debris began to settle, I began to very easily begin to separate the two and begin to see the green flags or the red flags and compare and contrast. And because Patrick took responsibility so quickly, refused to blame me or say any of it was my fault, which is all I was hearing from my ex during the divorce, is how it was all my fault. Every lick of it was my fault. Never once did he take responsibility. Because Patrick took responsibility so quickly and refused to blame me for his behavior, even while I was hurting, even while I was discovering more and more about how deep the deception went, he created safety by doing that. He created safety immediately by saying, I'm not going to tell you that this is your fault. I'm going to tell you that I've hurt you, and I'm going to try to work on fixing this problem, and I'm going to try to support you, but I'm never going to blame you. This is not your fault. That alone psychologically provides so much safety. So then I had this opportunity to really determine, I like this person. I like this person a lot. Now, my fear was, obviously, with my previous relationship, is he manipulating me? Is this all a facade? If he could do this and lie to me about this for so long, could he be like my ex, where it's all a lie and it's all a facade, right? I didn't think so, but I also didn't want to be stupid, right? So I took so much time. I gave myself so much time to not make a decision. That's one thing I hear so many people feel pressured, right? Like, are you in the relationship? Are you out of the relationship? When this happens, you know, especially if you're a Christian and you just feel pressure to forgive and do all these things, give yourself time. I needed everything to get untangled to the point where I knew what the reality was. That now that the secret was out, did I know who my husband was or not? Was he the person that I had been married to for this entire time and he had this addiction? Or is he someone that I don't know entirely and I'm just discovering? My hope was that he was the person that I had been married to and had this thing that he was struggling with. And that, thankfully, is what I found out. He was the person that I thought I was in a relationship with. The only thing he lied to me about or manipulated, because let's be honest, for about a decade, he did manipulate, he did lie, those things were in there. It was always centered around protecting his addiction. And there was nothing else that he was manipulating or lying. And as soon as it came out publicly, between the two of us, not publicly on TikTok, that was much later. As soon as it came out between the two of us and discovery was made, it was brought to the light, he wanted to change. And that made such a huge difference. As opposed to defending his behavior or blaming me, that made such a difference. So when I think about the two relationships, one thing that really comes to mind when you are comparing them is in my first marriage, I did not feel hope. In fact, I felt despair, which is ultimately what led me to verbalize that I was contemplating divorce. There was no hope. I didn't see or feel hope there. And ultimately, the relationship ended, obviously, partially because of that. And even in my current relationship with Patrick, even with all of the pain that we've gone through, all of the ups and downs of betrayal and recovery, from day one, I felt hope. I hoped that he would get into recovery. I hoped that he would stay there and be successful. I hoped that I could trust that he was the person that I thought he was. And I hoped that I could move through the pain. I hoped that we could make it. I was going to push myself. I wasn't going to force myself, but there was hope. So let me ask you today, because I feel like that is a defining factor. Do you feel like there is hope? Do you have evidence that there is hope? Because the reality is, in my first relationship, I could have felt hopeful, right? I sort of did when I said, I'm going to change my attitude. I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to make this work, right? That was creating hope for myself. But if I went really deep, right? Like I had a lot of evidence that this was not a healthy relationship. However, when I had everything happen with Patrick, I had so much evidence that we worked well as a couple, that our life could be happy together, that this could be an amazing relationship, that he was a person who did what he says he will do, that he's someone who could complete things and do things. I had so much evidence that this was a possibility. So do you have hope in your relationship? So let's just summarize some bullet points of the green flags when you are asking the question, do I stay or do I go? Is this a healthy relationship? Is this a healthy opportunity? One, what I just said, do you feel that there is hope and evidence that that hope is true? Is the partner who has betrayed you taking personal responsibility? That is a huge green flag. Huge green flag. Oh my goodness, huge green flag. The further away he gets from taking personal responsibility, the more, let's say, the stronger the red flag is. So if he starts to take responsibility but then have an excuse, or then he starts to blame, or he doesn't take any responsibility at all, that's sort of the gradation, the graduation towards really, really strong red flag. Is your partner supporting you and learning how to express empathy and understand the pain that his or her behavior has, the impact that it has had on you? Are they willing to acknowledge the hurt that you are feeling, sit with you and support you in that? Are they someone that is willing to do whatever it takes to make this work? Are they willing to go to trauma therapy? Are they willing to address the underlying issues behind the behavior? There's not a single case where someone has an addiction where there's not something underlying it, right? I love ice cream. I think I may have even mentioned this in a previous episode, right? If I had an ice cream addiction, there's something underneath that addiction. It's not just that I love ice cream, right? Like, I love ice cream. But it's not just that I love ice cream. It's that I had a stressful day and I'm using that to feel a little bit better and calm down at the end of the day, right? There's always an underlying reason. So are they willing to do the work that it takes to address that? That is a huge green flag. And one of the biggest things is, are they willing to respect your boundaries? Are they willing to hear what you need in order to feel safe? And the reality is, it's going to make them uncomfortable. It dramatically changes their life to have to be accountable to you in some ways, to maybe not be sleeping with you sexually or physically. There may be a lot of changes that occur in your house. Are they willing to do that? And when you establish those boundaries, how do they respond? When you establish a need for safety and you communicate to them, their responses tell you so much. And I hope by sharing my story that you were able to see the dramatic difference in responses. When you bring a boundary or a need for safety or an emotional vulnerability to someone who is manipulative or abusive or gaslighty or just emotionally unhealthy, then they will have a very negative response. They may be really emotionally charged when they respond. They may be really defensive, would be a really common one. Really, really defensive. Well, why do you need that, right? I'm not doing the behavior right now, or this, right? Things like that. Or Do they say, I understand that I've hurt you. I understand why you feel that way. I will do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. Those are two totally different responses. Totally different responses. And safety, as we have talked about many times in the podcast, is the number one thing. If you want one green flag, it would be, are you able to successfully establish safety in your relationship so that you feel like everything is stabilized? You don't feel like everything's going to blow up any minute, like the floor is going to fall out from underneath you. Do you feel like you can communicate to your partner? Do you feel like your boundaries are respected? Do you feel like you can communicate your feelings? Do you feel like you can have conversations and ask them questions about their own recovery? Are you able to see that they're making progress? All of these things establish safety when they are consistently done over time. If you can establish safety, and that is something that you both are on board with, then there is so much potential there for rebuilding a healthy, happy relationship. But if you are unable for any reason to establish safety in the relationship, it's a huge red flag, because we've talked about this previously with the nervous system. Physically, it is impossible for your body to heal when it is not able to live in a calm place. And so if it's constantly getting triggered by something that it considers dangerous or threatening, then your nervous system is constantly activated. And over time, this stress, whether you feel physically like you're living in stress or not, over time, this chronic level of stress begins to break things down in the body. So on a physical, and I would argue emotional level, your own emotional healing and your own movement forward in recovery is going to be hindered if safety is not established. And it makes a huge, huge difference in your ability to move forward and have a happy, healthy life, whether or not you choose to stay in the marriage or not. That's all I have for you today. I hope that sharing a little bit more of my story was helpful. There are so many different little avenues that I could go down in so many different parts of the story that I didn't share. But I hope that hearing that I have been betrayed and been divorced, and I've been betrayed and I've stayed, and they were very, 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 very different individuals who responded very differently to their behavior and had an incredibly different relationship with me. And I would argue that I was different in both relationships as well. I hope hearing how those were different just helps you think through some things. Maybe you could relate to parts of my story. Maybe it encouraged you. Maybe it gave you some hope. If you're in a relationship where you are pursuing divorce, maybe you feel hopeful that there is someone out there that you can have a really, really healthy relationship, not perfect, but healthy relationship with. I hope that hearing someone else's experience has been helpful for you today. And I just want to wrap this up by reminding you that there really is no quote unquote right decision. Everyone's story is so unique. Your background is unique. Your trauma is unique. Your marriage is unique. And no one else has the right to tell you what to do with your relationship. My hope for you is that you feel safe, that you feel loved, that you feel valued in your relationship, because that is what you deserve. Please remember that you are beautiful, you are worthy, and you are enough. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.